What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily. So this is the Samsung Galaxy A23, and I gotta be honest, this is kind of a weird phone. There's nothing wrong with it per se. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense in Samsung's lineup and where in the world it's being sold. And I'm also willing to make a bet that this will be one of the last non-5G phones that Samsung ships, which is actually great news for us. The A23 obviously sits between, I guess, the A13/A13 5G and the A33 5G. There's both two 5G phones that sandwich it and a lower tier non-5G phone, which is very confusing. And on top of it all, there's supposedly an A23 5G coming soon too. That's a lot of phones crammed within a very similar price and spec point. The other factor though is that this phone is sold mainly in Asia and Europe, not so much the US, where 5G is sort of the focus. And that makes sense. But outside the US, there's so many more budget and mid-range phones, both with and without 5G, that compete with and are better than this phone. In the US, not so much. In fact, Samsung's A-series lineup inside the US, where the A23 I think would do well in like the prepaid market, has actually been shrinking, while the international availability of all these different A-series phones has been growing and growing, where there's also increased competition. I hope that convoluted explanation sort of hits as to why I think this phone doesn't make a whole lot of sense. As a device though, it's mostly fine. You certainly get a better camera than the lesser A13s, for example, the full One UI software experience, not One UI Core, but the lack of 5G network capabilities and the choice to use lesser toned down internal specs because of that also sort of limits this phone performance-wise in some capacity. I'll certainly get into all that and everything else you need to know about this phone too, but in the meantime, let me know what you think of the A23 in the comments down below, especially if you have one and have been using it for a while. So the A23 is sort of interesting in that from the front, it looks just like any other lower end A-series device this year. At 6.6 inches, it's just as big as the rest, which is great if you like big screens, but it's not like you get the choice of any small screen devices anyway. There's a teardrop notch for the selfie camera, thicker bottom chin, more noticeable bezels all around. The lower 82.5% screen to body ratio is expected on a device like this, but that doesn't mean that people still won't take issue with all those borders. And in the hand, it feels just as large as any other 2022 Android device. It feels light though and sort of thin. It's curvy, a bit slippery, but it's the same old phone feel that most of us have gotten used to. Around back, this is the interesting part and also what makes this phone slippery. Rather than a matte plastic rear housing, Samsung went with a cheaper glossy finish and a one-piece housing. It matches the lesser A13 4G and it makes something like the A53 look almost premium, especially with its metal-like frame. Like I said in my A13 review, this one-piece gloss plastic makes the phone feel cheap and a bit dated. And I also worry with plastic corners and edges that it may not be as durable. I've already got some marks and scratches too, that just sort of happens with gloss plastic. So all in all, it's not my favorite build. Speaking of scratches, I should also mention that I definitely marked up the display as well, though this was a result of having a couple of phones in my pocket at once. Likely a camera lens or metal trim piece rubbed up against this. I definitely wouldn't call it normal wear and tear, as all my other A-series devices with this Gorilla Glass 5 have held up just fine, but I wanted to at least mention that. One thing that's nice about a budget phone like this though is that Samsung hasn't yet found an excuse to take away those hardware essentials. So on the side, you've got dual SIM and SD card support, which on a phone like this makes sense. You only get 64 gigs of internal storage anyway. The headphone jack is still there at the bottom as well, and a regular old side-mounted power button fingerprint setup. And this works perfectly fine. It's fast, it's accurate, it just makes sense. I'm glad Samsung kept this versus putting in some slower, more inaccurate budget in-display reader just for the sake of innovation. As far as the display, the days of Samsung offering AMOLED screens on their budget phones, like the A20, seem to be over with, or at least paused for now. This A23 gets a PLS LCD screen coming in at the Full HD 2408 by 1080 resolution for about 400 pixels per inch. And on a screen this size, first off, you need to have 1080 resolution, so we can check that box at least. It's perfectly sharp from a normal viewing distance, and yes, there are some phones in that $200 to $300 price range that are 720p. It being LCD, while Samsung's default color profile and calibration tend to look good, it's not going to be as bold or as bright as some people would like. I've also found this phone in particular to be a bit more cool blue. I think I'm maybe being a little picky here. It's perfectly fine for a viewing experience. I just think that even with this price range, Samsung could offer an OLED panel. They've literally done it before. What would be the standout display feature here for this phone is the high refresh rate 90 90Hz mode, but unfortunately, this is one of the more inconsistent high refresh rate phones I've come across. 60% of the time, it works every time, and I say that in jest. App to app, sometimes you'll have excessive frame drop when scrolling, and especially with closing and opening animations, and the Google Play Store, randomly for whatever reason, is especially choppy. I think the toned down processor inside this phone and older GPU have something to do with this. It's just kind of a weird thing to have on a phone like this that's supposed to be an upgrade, a perk, but it wound up being not so great. All in all, for general content consumption, this phone is perfectly fine, but nowadays, I think the standard, even for a budget phone like this, is a bit higher. Also, the out loud listening experience on this phone is on par with, I think, every mid-level and low-tier A-series phone from the last couple of years. It's a single speaker setup, it's not very loud, it's a bit muffled, it's fine, but it could be a lot better. So speaking of the internal specs and performance, let's dive into that now. And this I think is probably what holds this phone back most of all. Inside, the A23 is powered by a seemingly modern Qualcomm Snapdragon 680 processor, but its core configurations stem from 2016 and 2012 architectures. And those elements combined absolutely contribute to some choppy performance from time to time. Here are the Geekbench scores for those of you who care. It's not all bad news. Unlike some other lesser A-series phones, this A23 gets the full One UI experience, not One UI Core, and Android 12, though some Samsung features like Samsung Pay are still missing. I would mainly consider a device like this to be a one task at a time kind of phone. Jumping from app to app can be a little clunky sometimes, and doing two things at once isn't always best. But inside most apps, even the graphics intense apps like games for example, there's no inherent performance issues. It's just not that snappy, smooth, good feeling, good performing device that you might experience for maybe $100 more. And this brings me to one of my other main points from the start. This older internal hardware and architecture is absolutely what's limiting this phone. As soon as Samsung commits to the new 5G focused internals, this phone will get some new life. Brand new components that are more powerful and capable even for a lower end smartphone. And I'm looking forward to that. It's why I consider the A13 5G and A33 5G to be really good values. This A23 4G LTE though, while it's fine for most people who don't push their devices too hard, I think is just a bit too clunky at times to really compete, which is a shame. When it comes to battery life and longevity, the 5000 milliamp battery inside this phone definitely puts in the work, and I've been averaging at least 16 hours of screen on time under lighter usage day to day. This is a phone I don't personally push too hard because I don't think most people would be either, and I suspect a lot of folks could get 2 days of use out of it without having to be plugged in. It's going to beat out the higher end, more spec'd out, more demanding smartphones for sure, but what you don't get here is any special or particularly fast charging features. No wireless charging, and while the phone supports 25 watt speeds, you get a 15 watt charger in the box, which takes nearly 2 full hours to juice this thing back up to 100% from dead. No lower tier A-series phone does any better, but lots of devices from other companies certainly offer better, faster charging setups. As far as the camera setup goes, out of everything on this phone, this is actually where you get the most value and see the biggest upgrades over something like the A13 or even the A13 5G. So around back, the quad lens setup consists of a 50 megapixel f1.8 aperture main lens, a very useful 5 megapixel 123 degree ultra wide lens, a not so useful 2 megapixel macro lens, and the 2 megapixel depth sensor. The selfie camera is a measly 8 megapixel shooter, but it takes better pics than its specs would suggest. And inside the camera app, while you do get a few more shooting modes and camera features than the low-level A-series phones, there are a handful of limitations. A dedicated night mode is nice to see on a phone like this. That's usually the first thing that's missing on a cheaper device. There's manual mode, which is very limited, and a handful of other standard stuff like slow-mo and panorama. Like I mentioned, having a wide-angle lens on this phone is one of the biggest perks as well, and it's something you don't normally see on cheap phones too. You can utilize the full 50 megapixel mode for the main lens too for some extra detailed shots. There's also enhanced video stabilization, but obviously no 4K video or anything beyond 1080-30. With the actual results, this phone definitely shoots better than you'd think, but conditions have to be just right. You get a crazy bright and colorful shot, maybe a little too punchy at times. The real world is definitely not this vivid, but it's eye-catching to say the least, and makes up for maybe a lack of detail at times. The wide angle is relatively relatively consistent color-wise and exposure-wise compared to the main lens, which is good. The biggest issue here is just low light stuff. The dynamic range is quite poor on the low end. Shadows and dark spots go completely black pretty easily. And while the dedicated night mode is available, it's not always great, and in fact, it's sometimes unusable. Like I said though, this is a step up from the A0s and A1s, like the A03 and the A13. It's just still very much a budget phone, while I think something like the A33 or A53 would be best for folks who specifically care a lot about pictures. So all in all, the A23 is a mostly fine semi-budget device with a few perks and a few compromises, but I just think that it's tough to consider when you have a cheaper A13 5G and a slightly more expensive A33 5G that I think are both better values for the money in their own ways. And on top of that, there are a lot of other smartphones in this price range for the international market that are better too. It really just stems from the fact that since this isn't a 5G phone, the internals are dated, they're not as powerful as they should be, the performance is sacrificed quite a bit, and I don't think this phone is a good long-term investment nowadays either. So like I explained at the start, I suspect this will be one of the last non-5G Samsung phones offered, and moving forward, I could see some of next year's A series devices in this price tier be even better. But what do you guys think about the A23? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, of course. Hopefully you guys did enjoy this video though. Be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.